Thanks for joining us on a holiday weekend. I'm excited to dive into the Word with you. Before I share this first story, I just want to read from Revelation 21:21. It says this: "The streets of the city were made of pure gold." This is John's revelation of what the future heaven and earth will be like. And that being said, there was a rich man who was quite distressed over the prospect of not being able to take his riches with him when he died. So before he died, he loaded his briefcase with 2 gold bars from his private vault and left instructions to have the case locked with a key, handcuffed to his wrist, and the key placed into his grave clothes at his funeral. Side note, when I was a kid, I wanted, when I died, for my Super Nintendo to be put in my casket. So that's what I was going to do forever, I guess. And so his family carried out his orders correctly to the letter. When he appeared at the pearly gates, he had his briefcase with him, key in hand. St. Peter asked, "What do you have in your suitcase?" Very proudly, the man unlocked the case and opened it and displayed 2 gold bars. St. Peter said, "Isn't that special? You brought pavement." See, the first service, I should have cut that, but I got a second one. I'm going to go with this one. I think this is a little better. A man died and went to heaven. He is at the pearly gates by St. Peter, who led him down the golden streets. By the way, this is the joke. It's terrible theology. It's not what happens, but just, go with me. They walked by mansion after beautiful estate until they came to the end of the road where they stopped in front of a little shack. The man asked St. Peter why he got such a simple hut when there were so many mansions where he would feel more comfortable. St. Peter replied, "I did the best with the money you sent us." Now today, we're finishing our story, our series in Made for More. We've talked about hope, we've talked about courage, we've talked about mission, and today we're going to talk about generosity. So everybody say generosity. See, I was very surprised. I thought both services would be like, generosity. Like, you guys are excited about it. I like that. Today we're ending our series talking about generosity. Next week we're starting in the book of Acts. It's going to be great. And I just want to say this to set up our next few minutes together. I think it's interesting that often as soon as we hear that we're going to be looking at or studying or reading or talking about the need to be generous, all of us, like me included, we kind of get this like defensive reaction that I think is quite unlike any of the other commands that God gives us. Like, for example, if we're going to say, hey, we're looking at love this morning, no one's like, man, like, I don't want to hear more about this. You're just going to tell me to be more loving. Like, that's not our response, right? Or it's like forgiveness. I mean, why are churches always talking about forgiveness? I forgive enough as it is. Yet when it comes to generosity, if we're honest, we all feel this. Like there's this quick justification as to why maybe it's good for other people to hear this, but why we are doing well enough in this area at the time right now, and so this doesn't really apply to us. And so I just want to maybe encourage us this morning from the start. Can instead of us being like, man, I'm not sure about this generosity thing, can I encourage us to excitedly actually lean in to what God has to say about it? Because I don't know about you, but I don't know if there is a better description of our God than generosity. Like, I don't know if there is a better way to describe him. I mean, when you think about the gospel, it's that God is giving something to us that we could never repay. There is something that he needs from us, that we cannot give anything to him that he does not already have. And yet in his generosity, he sent Jesus to do for us, to stand in our place so that anyone who repents of their sins and trusts in Jesus can be children, can be sons of daughters in the kingdom, welcomed into the kingdom of God. We serve a mightily generous God. And so I think for us, maybe when it comes to the topic of generosity, I think what we should do instead of saying, man, this is how we can best display who God is to the world. And that is what we are looking at this morning, right? How to better reflect the God who saved you if you are in Christ Jesus to the world, so the world can better know him. And so I think maybe rather than maybe sometimes this natural defensive posture we can get when we hear about generosity, like I need to protect what I have, instead, man, we get to learn about how we can lean in and be best like Jesus. Like this morning, we're talking about how can we best reflect Jesus to the world. Maybe I put it this way, that I think generosity best teaches us how to be like Jesus. Generosity, being open-handed with what God has given us, best teaches us and best reflects who Jesus is to the world. Generosity best teaches us how to be like Jesus, and that's what we get to look at this morning. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at a few verses in Matthew chapter 6. If you have a Bible, you can turn there. If not, there's a black one either in the seat in front of you or the seat below you. And if you do not own a Bible, you can take one of those homes. That is our gift to you. Matthew chapter 6 is right in the middle of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. In the Sermon on the Mount, he is talking about how to participate in and how to live out the kingdom of God. He's talked about adultery, murder, all these things, praying, all these things. What it looks like to honor me and honor my Father. And then he gets to his well-known passage on generosity, on financial resources. He says this, Matthew chapter 6, starting verse 19. He says, don't store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where the thieves don't break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Now, I do real quick, I want to point out that when we hear the word treasure, like we likely think of pirates burying treasure or going on a treasure chest or treasure hunt for a treasure chest, that sort of thing. I think it might be more helpful for us when we see treasure, the word treasure here translated as treasure, to understand it as the word wealth. So not wealthy, because most of us would say, I'm not wealthy, I don't have all this stuff, but like wealth. That all the different things that can make up one's wealth portfolio, which would be your income, your home, house, cars, investments, any assets you have is your treasure. It is your wealth. And what Jesus is saying here is that your things, these monetary things you have, these resources that you have, that we have on earth, that we accumulate on earth, they will not last forever, but God's kingdom will. And so be careful. We should be careful, because if you focus on storing up the wrong type of treasure, you'll one day wake up and realize that you missed it. And that instead, what we should do is we should focus on building sky wealth or sky treasure or heavenly treasure, what he says here, instead of earthly wealth or earthly treasure. Because that is the currency, the kingdom of God, the kingdom of the skies, sky treasure, sky wealth. That is the currency that can never be taken away. Never be taken away. In fact, in verse 20, Jesus implies here that we actually have a choice of the type of wealth we will accrue. He says, but rather store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. That you and I have a choice in how we are going to do this. Now, I do think it's easy for us to forget this, because there's a lot of things in life that maybe take our resources. We think, well, I have to have a car payment. I've got to have clothes that look, at least somewhat good. All the streaming services that used to be cable, then they kind of had just Netflix, but now to watch everything, I have to get all the services to get all the things. So money can be tied on top of that. And so what can we do, rather? How can we ensure that even though we have necessities and we're not maybe overspending in some areas, how can we also at the same time be generous and invest in the type of wealth that cannot be taken away from us? How can we actually do that? Because again, Jesus says this in verse 21, for where your treasure is, where your wealth is, there your heart will be also. Now, in the ancient world, it's helpful to know that heart was like synonymous, or it implied not just your emotions. Like today, we kind of think of your heart as like your emotions and your feelings. But in the ancient world, it was like a synonymous word for the one center of beings. So not just your emotion, but also your reason and your will and your intellect, like your very being was summed up in your heart. And so what Jesus is saying here, what this means is that we do not think our way to faithfulness, that we act our way to faithfulness, that where our treasure is, what we do with our treasure will lead our heart, will lead our entire being. Or put another way, what you do with your money determines how you think about money. And we often assume it's the other way around, like what I think or my intentions or how I may want to be generous one day, or I want to do this, like as long as my intentions are good or I think about it, then I'm okay. But according to Jesus, you actually have to do something. And what you do as you act in the way of accordance or in the way of Jesus, then your heart will follow. It is not your intentions, it is not your thoughts, it is your actions that train your heart. Think of it like this. When I was young, my parents gave us allowance every week, and we had this folder, and there was different sections. So there was quick cash, which means we could spend it whenever we wanted. There was like savings, there was car savings, and then there was tithe. And every week, my parents would give us these little categories. And I remember thinking, I hear other parents talk about, how they do money with their kids, whatever. And sometimes parents would be like, man, you do all these 4 categories. I mean, that's a lot of money. That adds up to be a lot of money every week. And I always wanted to interject. I was like, actually, my friends get more money from their parents because my friends don't do allowance. And every time they ask their parents for like $20 for this or to go do this, they always say yes, right? They always say yes. But we could only spend the money that we had in our quick cash. Like they're very intent on showing us, like, if you don't have the money, can't do it. In fact, I remember one time I was buying a video game off of eBay. I don't know why. I mean, this was before Amazon, by eBay. And I had, like, no joke, it was something like 57 cents. It was like 57 cents more than what I had. And my dad would not let me buy it, which means I had to wait until the entire next week, the next weekend, for my allowance to buy it. And so I told my dad, I said, listen, I'm going to go look around the house and see if I can find some, like, change. And if I find change, he was going to let me buy it. So I go upstairs. I waited like 20 minutes, but what I did is I went upstairs straight to his room, because in his dresser, he had like this coin jar. And I got like 57 cents out, put it in my pocket, and then just like walked around the house and like pretended I was looking for money. And then lo and behold, 20 minutes later, I could buy the game, okay? So that's what it was for me. I was also kind of stingy. Like, I would never like buy stuff. I always accumulated a lot. And then one summer, we lived not very far from this little shopping center. It had like a Food Lion or Lowe's and like a Rudino's pizza, that sort of thing. And so for whatever reason, like every day, me and my friends would walk down to the Rudino's for lunch, which wasn't a problem for them because they could just ask their parents for more money, but I eventually ran out. I ran out. However, the tithe money, I hadn't brought it to church in a long time, and so there was like a lot of tithe money there, probably like over a year's worth. And so what I started to do was I started to slowly use the tithe money. And my justification was, I'm a good kid, like I don't go crazy, I don't get in trouble, it's not fair that they get to have this, go to Rudino's every day and I don't. And so and eventually I ran out. And one weekend my dad asked me where my tithe money went. And I told him that I had already brought it to the church because I had a lot in there, so I brought it to church. And he was like, okay, like next time, like let me know before you do it. So not only like stole the money, I lied about it. And that's why I'm a pastor. Like to this day, I'm still like trying to do penance for what happened there. Now I share this story because, man, I justified, it doesn't matter. What I actually did with that money, that's what mattered. I thought, here's all the reasons why I don't need to give this. It's okay for me to use it this way. And what I'm doing there, according to Jesus, is I'm training my heart a certain way. And it's not in the way of Jesus, because it's what you actually do with your money that shapes how you think of it, how you handle it. In fact, Jesus continues, he says this in verse 22. He says, the eye is the lamp of the body. If your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. So if the light within you is darkness, how deep is that darkness? Now, the eye was another metaphor, just like the heart was the metaphor for your being. He's not talking about like how well you can see, but rather in the ancient world, the eye was another metaphor as a lamp that reveals the inside quality or character or characteristics of a person's inner life. And so saying you have a healthy eye suggests good character, a love for God, a person who's living with integrity, and a bad eye signifies corruption. Like internally, you're not walking on the path of righteousness. And so put another way, what Jesus is saying is that if the input is bad, so what you do with your actions is bad, the output is going to be bad. It will corrupt your heart. Of course, if you compound this with the stress of financial hardships and the unknowingness of life, like if we are not intentionally generous, we can train our hearts in a way that is not in line with Jesus. So it's why he says this, verse 24, no one can serve two masters, since he will either hate one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Literally what he's saying here is you cannot be a servant of, or you cannot be a slave of two masters. Now, this is not that money is bad and you shouldn't need it at any way, or you should never want it or anything like that. But what Jesus is saying is you have to choose what is more important. You have to choose what is going to be your master. Is it the things of God, or is it what you can do with your resources? Because at the end of the day, it's true for every single one of us. We will always choose what we think we need most. You have to decide what is most important, because you will choose what you think you need most. And I think what Jesus is trying to tell us here is that money isn't your greatest need. What Jesus is teaching us, money isn't your greatest need. That's his point. Now hear me. It's not that it is not a need. It's not that it does not matter or that you should not work for it or have any of it. It's just that it's not your greatest need. Yes, we need resources to live. In fact, I mean, Jesus' audience is primarily Jewish people here, and first century Israel was occupied by Rome, so they were not Roman citizens. They had no like human rights. Like it was not, a lot of them were very, very poor. So he's talking to an audience who is in need. And he's not saying their physical needs do not matter, or it does not matter how much money they have, but what he is saying is that you need to be open-handed and trust me. In fact, the scriptures talk about the need for being financially wise. The Proverbs talks about investing, or there's a warning against laziness and not providing for your family. Even the Apostle Paul picks it up in the New Testament. He says a man who is unwilling to work and provide for his family is in some ways worse than an unbeliever. So like we should work and we should have money to care for our family and our kids. It's not wrong to have money or to work for it. It's just not the most important thing. And you have to realize that, otherwise you will be a slave to your resources, to your earthly wealth. It's not your greatest need. Now, it's important to realize that because if you think something is like the greatest need and it's not, it'll lead you to behave a certain way that isn't that helpful. So, for example, this is just traditionally speaking here, talk to the men, I'll talk to the women. Men who are husbands, or men who are married, so husbands. A lot of men are like, I got to provide for my wife and my family, and I got to take a bullet for her. Which is true. You want to care for your family well, and you want to protect your family. However, in the normal like day-to-day, everyday living, that's not actually what your wife most wants, is not that you'll take a bullet for her. Is she wants you to help. Like she wants you to help with the kids, or do the dishes, or vacuum, or clean the car, or like she just like wants your help. And if you need some motivation, man, think of it like chore play. That might be helpful. For some of you, if you get that, if not, I can't help you with that, okay? Right, so here's the thing, like I gotta lay down my life for my wife and for my kids. Great. But what she really needs for you is like, she needs your help. And if you don't help her in things that matter, it can lead to like a hard marriage. On the flip side, like, maybe speak to women for a second. One of the best ways, you may not know this, one of the best ways you can love your husband is to actually like think about your finances. Like, let me just give you an example. I read a book last year called His Needs, Her Needs. It's a little dated, but it's like really, really good. And as I was reading the book, I was like telling Christina, I was like, oh, this makes more sense. Like women think about relationships a lot. Friendships, if they're married, their spouse, roommates, all the time. Guys are like, I don't even care. We came to blows yesterday. We're just like, we don't ever think about that stuff. We're just whatever, right? And so I was telling Christina, I was like, the amount of effort or the amount of time you think you spend spending about our marriage is the same amount of time I spend thinking about our finances, like all the time. And it's not because I'm trying to be like super greedy, but I'm like, we got kids, we're foster parents, we're going to need braces one day. What if they go to college? We got a mortgage to pay for. We've got this vacation that we want to do. Like there's experiences we want to do with our kids before they get too older. Like every single day, I'm like thinking about how we're doing. And so one of the ways that Christina can like care for me is just like to be cognizant of like, this is a big deal for me. It's a big deal. And so again, knowing what your spouse cares about helps you care for them well. And I think for us, man, our hearts follow what we treasure most. Our treasure does not follow our heart, but our life follows what we do with our treasure. Meaning, here's what this means, that we have to decide and we have to train ourselves to treasure the right things so that our hearts will follow suit. And generosity is how we train our hearts. It's how we train our hearts. In fact, in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, the Apostle Paul is writing to the church in Corinth. Now, this is a church in modern-day Turkey now, and he's writing basically that there is, in one part of the letter, he's raising money for Christians facing persecution in Jerusalem. So for the church in Jerusalem, and that when he comes and visits the church in Corinth, he's going to take the money that they collected with him as he goes to Jerusalem, okay? Then he says this, verse 6. The point is this, the person who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. And the person who sows generously will also reap generously. Each person should do as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or out of compulsion, since God loves a cheerful giver. By the way, some people are like, hey, what do I do if I'm not cheerful about giving? Well, just remember, we often have to train ourselves to do something we enjoy. Like some people, the crazy people that love going to the gym, many of them will tell you they didn't like it until they started doing it. They saw the benefits. Now they miss a day and it drives them crazy. If you want to know how to become a cheerful giver, it's not by waiting till you feel happy to give. It's by training your heart and remembering what Jesus has done. Verse 8, and God is able to make every grace overflow to you, so that in every way, always having everything you need, you may excel in every good work. In other words, Paul here is repeating the wisdom of Jesus, and that is that we reap what we sow. We reap what we sow. And if we do not sow this sky treasure or this heavenly wealth, the kind that lasts forever, we will not reap it. And so each person should be generous, not out of compulsion or obligation or just trying to check a box, but out of an overflow of what God has done for us, remembering that God has been generous to us, and so that impacts how we are generous to others. And that those who have, give, and those who do not have, who are not generous, do not. And again, if God has been exceedingly generous towards us, and the scriptures say that we can trust him, to not be generous is to not fully understand what God has done for you and how much he loves you. Or let me put it another way, man, followers of Jesus are marked by generosity. That's the wisdom Paul has for us here, that the followers of Jesus are marked like our Lord. And so the question then often becomes like, especially if you're a follower of Jesus, we know that being generous is important. But how much? Like, how much does it count? And I think most of us, ask that question with a good heart. It's not that you're just trying to check a box, but you genuinely want to know, okay, how can I ensure that I am being generous in the way of Jesus? Like, how much should I give for it to, count? Or do I give enough? Or do Christians have to tithe? Do Christians have to give 10% of their income? And as long as they do that, then they're being generous. Like, what do we do? Well, real quick, I just want to give you some context here. Tithing is an Old Testament concept that you find in the Old Testament. The tithe was a requirement of the law in which the ancient Israelites were to essentially give 10% of the crops that they grew and the livestock that they raised to the temple and the tabernacle. Most people are living off the land at this time, and so 10% of what you made was donated to the temple and the tabernacle for the feasts, for the sacrifices, for all the festivals that they were going to do. You can read it, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, 2 Chronicles, all over the place. In fact, what's interesting is that in the Old Testament law for the ancient Israelites actually required multiple tithes or multiple maybe generosity initiatives. So there was one for the Levites. There are 12 tribes of Israel, and then you had the Levites. The Levites did not inherit any land in the Promised Land, and they didn't work like everybody else. The Levites were the priestly clan, and so they did all the sacrifices. They went around the country, teaching God's law. They did all that stuff. So their income, essentially, they lived off some of the sacrifices that people gave to them. Used to help so the Levites could live. So there was that. There was one that I just spoke of for the temple and the sacrifices. There was a tithe for that. And there was also a tithe for the poor of the land. Now, it's not that the Israelites always did this, but they were instructed that there was also an offering to be collected for those who are less fortunate to help care for the people in their land who needed help. Which actually, if you calculate all the different ways they were supposed to be giving, it actually comes to 23.3%. So 23.3% of their money was given away. In fact, some argue, and I think it's not wholly inaccurate, to say that the Old Testament tithe was also a method of taxation for the ancient Israelites because it provided for the needs of the priests and the Levites, the sacrificial system, and their community. So it's kind of like a tax system as well for Israel. Now, obviously for us, we are not ancient Israelites. We don't live in Israel. We don't have the Levites. We don't have a temple. We don't have a sacrificial system. And in the New Testament, there's actually no command about giving 10% or 23.3% or a tithe. It doesn't say Christians should do that. In fact, we already do pay taxes to the government that we live under. So is that are we good then? Is that why am I doing all that stuff? What do we do? In fact, a couple of years ago, I was having a lunch with a guy in New City, and we were talking for a while, and somehow money came up. And tithing came up, and he was asking me and my views on it, and he was sharing his views on it. He said that he thinks Christians should give 10%. They should tithe 10% of their income should be given. And so I'm like, okay, that sounds good. Eventually I said, so do you give 10%? And he looks at me, he's like, I mean, no, not right now. I'm like, okay. And then I said, so are you sinning? Right? Because you're saying Christians are to do this. You think we are to do this. You're not doing this. You're therefore disobeying a command of God. Does that mean you're in sin? And he's like, I don't think so. I don't know, whatever. So that's the question. how much is enough to be like, hey, I'm doing what God's asked me to do? Well, again, Scripture is primarily wisdom literature. Hear me. Scripture is not a rule book. Now, it's not to say there are not rules in it, but it is not a rule book. Man, it is wisdom literature. Here is who God is, how he has revealed himself to us, and how we can walk with him. And so a lot of times you get wisdom principles, not like here's what exactly you need to do, because every situation is different. And so in 1 Corinthians 16, we get another wisdom principle from Paul. He's writing to the Corinthians again, talking about another collection that he's going to be taking from them to some of the other churches. He says this, 1 Corinthians 16, verse 1. Now the collection for the saints do the same as I instructed the Galatian churches. On the first day of the week, each of you is to set something aside and save in keeping with how he is prospering, so that no collections will need to be made when I come. In other words, when I show up, instead of saying, hey, we need to give to this, be doing this consistently so that when I show up, I can just take what has already been given. And the principle that I think Paul has for us here is that we should have a practice of intentional and consistent generosity. Intentional and consistent generosity. It's not just if or when I get a bonus, or like I had a really good week or a really good month financially, or when I feel really inspired. Although, hear me, you should also still be generous when that happens. Like you should not, like if the Spirit is convicting you to do this or to be generous with this extra income or whatever, like do that. But don't let that be the only time. But rather be living consistently a generous life, that you would practice it, that you would, like Jesus said, train your heart in it, that you would reflect Jesus in your generosity, because where your treasure is, how you handle your treasure, there your heart will be also. So again, I would make this like maybe some super practical things to think through. Like what does it look like for me to be consistently generous? Well, one way to think of it is like this, is that after the necessities, and again, we should be clear on what the necessities are and if we are overspending on some of them. Like, for example, I'm not saying you can't have a nice car if you're into cars and you can afford it, but if your car payment restricts your ability to be generous, the issue is not that you have a car, it's the car payment that you're spending that is the problem. Not that you can't have a car, it just might not be wise. But after the necessities, the things that we actually need to live on, what do you spend your money on? That shows what you care about. What you spend your money on shows what you care about. Maybe another way to look at it, is there anything that I miss out on because of my generosity? Is there anything that I could do, not to say that I can never do the thing or never have fun, but is there anything in my life that I miss out on because of my generosity? Or maybe think of it this way, and I think this is more of a starting point, because depending on how much you make, this is different. You would answer this differently. But maybe based on my socioeconomic status, which might be determined based on where you live, like if you live in a house in a neighborhood, or your coworkers typically might make something similar to you. On my socioeconomic status, is there anything in my socioeconomic class, rather, that I do not have that other people have because my generosity gets in the way? Is there anything I have? Is there a car, vacations, living situation, travel? Again, not that you can never travel, can't have a nice place to live, can't have the dream house, not saying that. But is there anything that you miss out on that other people in your same socioeconomic class have, not because maybe you were unwise with your money and you're like in a bunch of debt or something bad happened, whatever, but because you're not being generous? Again, it's not that you can't have things, have savings, have things to work for, can't do that. But is my threshold lowered in any way? Right? And this includes me, right? This includes me. Like, for example, like we always said, our oldest daughter's 9, that by the time she was like 10, we were going to go to Disney. So we're going to go to Disney next year, and that is like dumb expensive. Like we're going to it's stupid. Like we're saving for that. But is there other areas in our life that we are restricted from because we are being generous? And so I think one of the ways it's helpful for me to think through this is that I am somebody who has a lot. In fact, I've shared this before, we tell our kids that we're rich because we are rich. I can't speak for your living situation, but where I live, there is this thing on the wall with buttons. And all I have to do is press up or down, and regardless of how hot or cold it is outside, I can set my house to whatever temperature I want. And there's no humidity. I have these machines in our house where you could take dirty clothes and you throw them in, and then they're clean. Or there's this machine, it's kind of loud in our kitchen, where you take dirty dishes and you put it in and you come out and it's clean. In fact, never in my life, I know it's maybe not true for everybody, in my life, there has never been a single day that I've ever existed where I've wondered if I could have dinner that night. Never. I'm rich. In fact, this is helpful for me when things come up or when there's generosity initiatives or whatever. It's really hard. Not to say there's not like this internal like trying to be stinginess to me, but like it's really hard to say no to this generosity thing if I'm telling myself I'm rich. Because those things don't go together. They don't go together. And so man, is there anything that I do that I miss out on because of my intentional and consistent generosity? Now, the question is, I think, also rightly asked, well, what if you're in a situation where you really don't have much? Because even living in America, like there's single parents, a loss of a job, a health situation. Like maybe there was some financial unwise choices made in your past, and so you're still like dealing with those things, school debt, whatever. Like some people are in situations where they really don't have much. Expenses are high, and they it's like if I do less than people in my same socioeconomic status, like I'm already doing less. So then what do? Well, fortunately, there is wisdom for you. In Mark chapter 12, last thing we'll read, Jesus is in the temple in Jerusalem. Okay, he's in the temple in Jerusalem, and it says this. Sitting across from the temple treasury. So this is the part of the temple where people would come and give their monetary donations. Jesus, that's he, watched how the crowd dropped money into the treasury. Many rich people were putting in large sums. Then a poor widow came and dropped in 2 tiny coins worth very little. Now, just some context here. In the temple in Jerusalem, Jesus is observing people bringing their financial offerings in. And one of the important functions of the temple in Jerusalem was that it was also a depository for vast amount of wealth, especially in Jerusalem because the temple was so big, which it got in the form of dues, taxes, donations for the work on the temple, various things. Again, it's helpful to remember, too, in the ancient world, like their society wasn't so fragmented or sectioned off as ours was. And so the temples, even like the pagan temples, they were not just for religious purposes, they were for civic purposes as well. So a lot of community stuff happened at the temple. In fact, a lot of temples were also a repository. That is, they were kind of like a bank where wealthy people in particular would store their money. Because, you have to put it somewhere. And so there was this belief that they were more sacred. They were less likely objectively to be broken into. And so some wealthy people would actually store money at temples. And so, in fact, Josephus, who was around in the first century, he was a Roman historian, he wrote that the person in charge, the officer in charge of the financial administration of the temple in Jerusalem was the second in importance in Jerusalem only to the chief priest. So you're the chief priest of the Jews in Jerusalem. He was like the head honcho. And the second most important person in the temple area, which was like the main part of the city, was the person who was in charge of the money. So that's how important it is. And we have ancient writings that talked about in the temple in Jerusalem, there are 13 different areas where you would go and bring money to in the treasury area. And what would happen is if you had a monetary donation to give, you'd come to one of the attending priests, and they would do 2 things. They would inspect your money to make sure it was real, and then they would ask what the money was for, and then they would direct you to a certain treasury box for what you're giving to, because that money would go towards certain things. And if you were close by enough, which Jesus probably was here, you could also hear their conversations. Like, okay, what's this for? How much? Likely this woman's dress, the way she was dressed, would have also given away the fact that she was very poor. And so we don't know how Jesus knows how much she's giving. Maybe she heard, he heard her conversation, or maybe he heard how much she dropped into the bin. You would be able to hear that as well. But she knows that she gives 2 coins. Now, the Greek word for coin here is lepton, which was essentially 1/64th of a day's wage. And if you don't know how to do math, which I don't, I did it for you. If you make $20 an hour and you work 9 hours a day, that's $2.50. Okay? Now, she likely had no job or a very poor paying one. And so in all reality, her donation is probably 10 cents. It's so insignificant. Every once in a while when I'm cleaning up in the auditorium during the week, I'll see a dime or a quarter. And you might not know this, but there is not an ounce of I'm going to keep that. Anytime I see it, I'm just drop it right in the giving box. There's no, now if it was $100, I would still drop it off in the giving box, okay? But I would have to check myself, but that's but it's so insignificant. If I saw the floor, I'm I don't know, who needs this? It's not going to do anything. That's what she gives, okay? And here's what Jesus says, verse 43. Summoning his disciples, he said to them, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. For they all gave out of their surplus, but she gave out of her poverty. She out of her poverty has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." So Objectively speaking, this woman pretty much gives nothing. Gives nothing. Yet according to Jesus, it's worth more than what everyone else is doing. Why? Because unlike all these other people who were giving out of their excess, it really didn't hurt them that much, she gave out of her need. She's actually making a sacrifice. And so all that being said, if I could maybe sum up one way that you could define generosity, you could say it like this. Generosity is sacrificing what you could do for what you can do. Generosity is sacrificing what you could do for what you can do. Now, when I say could do, I mean here's the income I have, here's the extra money I have, here's all the things I could do with it. And I'm going to sacrifice some of my could money, some of my quick cash, as I said growing up, some of that for the difference that I actually can make. I can help here, I can do this, I can trust the Lord in this area. I'm going to sacrifice some of what I could do for what I actually can do. And so can I just say, man, you can give 10% and not be very generous. You can do that. I think that's awesome. I think that's a great thing to shoot for. And some people, man, you've been following Jesus for so long. You've been giving 10% for so long. I'm not trying to downplay. That's a significant amount. That's awesome. But it can become so routine that it doesn't really matter to you anymore. It's just kind of a thing you do. And so it is generous objectively, but it's not what Jesus is asking you to do. On the flip side, man, but you could give 1% and be very generous. If you've never given, if you've never taken the step of consistently trusting the Lord with generosity, that could be a lot for you. That could be very generous. In fact, some of us have been following Jesus for a long time, and our needs are taken care of. We should ask ourselves if our current levels of generosity are in the way of Jesus. Or maybe put it this way, I think a lot of times we ask ourselves, how much should I give? That's the question. How much should I give? But it might be more helpful to ask, how much should I keep? Here's what God's given me. Here's how much I take in. How much of this should I keep? Is it growing at all? Am I both trusting God and displaying God's character in my generosity? Am I trusting Him in any way? So maybe real practically as I close, maybe one of three steps I think most all of us can take when it comes to generosity. The first, for some of us, man, it might be giving for the first time. Actually trusting what Jesus says, that your heart dictates your life. That hey, I'm going to trust the Lord. Hey, I want to be generous in the way of Jesus. I actually have to be generous. But for some of us, it's being generous for the first time, actually giving. For some of us, we do this every once in a while. We throw the $20, we give online, or $20 in the giving box, maybe because we had a good month, or maybe we feel guilty because it's been a while, or the pastor preached on generosity, so I should do that. So we do that every once in a while. Instead of doing that, but do the wisdom of Jesus and Paul, but consistently practice generosity. Go from these random one-offs to I'm just going to consistently 1%, 2%, whatever, 5. I'm going to consistently start somewhere. So that, like Jesus said, I can train my heart and train my life to plan to be consistent. That's the second option. Or the third option, maybe some of us, maybe we need to increase our generosity. That we've taken steps and we are following in the way of Jesus, but we know that Jesus is asking us to do more. And can I just say, so often we kind of maybe break down, tell me what I should do. Listen, if you're a follower of Jesus, you have the Spirit of the living God inside of you. You know what you need to do. You don't need me to tell you. You know what your step is. The Spirit leads you in that if you ask Him. Now, I want to say this too, all of our generosity does not, nor should it go to your local church. I'm not saying that. Now, as a side note, I do want to say it was completely coincidental that this is the first week that we're actually going to start passing the plate. I'm just kidding. We don't do that. that would be really bad. No, I'm just kidding that. But I'm not saying it has to go to the church. But it should go somewhere. But I do say this, if you are a follower of Jesus, you should give to your local church. If it's not New City, I would encourage you to join a local church that you feel comfortable financially supporting the mission. Okay? Some of it at least should. I'm not saying all of it, but some of it should. Again, if you're a follower of Jesus, again, you should join a church that you're comfortable getting behind, that you feel excited to invite your friends to. Maybe last point of encouragement, I would say, there's so many times in our life that we might talk to a friend or a spouse or a roommate that we maybe want some accountability, like this porn or drinking or how to talk to your kids, just this thing going on in your life, and you say, hey, would you ask me about how I'm doing with this, or let's hold each other accountable about this. Can I encourage you, you can also do this when it comes to generosity. Like if the Spirit's doing something inside of you, you should tell a spouse or a friend or a roommate, hey, like I want to take a step in this. Can you ask me about how I am doing in this area? It's a great thing to do this with somebody else. Remember, man, you were made to be generous. We were created in God's image, and God is an abundantly generous God. So generosity is simply sacrificing what you could do for what you can do in the way of Jesus, trusting him and being light as he has been generous towards us. Hey, thanks so much for checking out this video. We upload new videos every week to help encourage you in your faith in Jesus. So be sure to subscribe to this channel so that you'd never miss a thing.